Welcome to Kubernetes SIG Architecture for Thursday, April 11th, 2019. To get to the agenda and minutes, it's at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And I'll go ahead and drop the link into chat for everyone. Today, as we've come to our new format, we're going to cover each of our major sub-projects along with KEPs, because we're just kicking off 1.15, and everything that goes in, again, has to go through a KEP, and SIG Architecture has some involvement in that. And so with that, the very first thing we have up is code organization, and underneath that we have the Go modules update. And Jordan, I think you're on and the one who can talk about this.
Yep. So a couple updates. First of all, we talked about doing a tech talk that kind of just walked through use of Go modules, how they worked, how people can use them, not even necessarily specific to Kubernetes, just an introduction to the topic. And so we did that yesterday in API Machinery. That was recorded, and there's a video link there. And all of the materials, demo, repos, and scripts and everything that we did are also published. So if you missed that, take a look at that. If there's anyone interested in the topic who would like an introduction, you can point them to that. And questions and feedback are certainly welcome. Jumping down to how Kubernetes is using Go modules, our use of Go modules to manage the vendor directory has merged. So in Kubernetes master, we are no longer using GoDeps. That has been removed from our tree. That has already let us do things like identify and get up to date several of our dependencies. There was a pull request that upgraded about 20 of our dependencies, and it did so in a really structured way, like one commit per dependency. That would have taken about 5 hours to do previously, and now it takes about 20 minutes, which is awesome. There are some follow-up items that we're working on around making sure all the various places we document management are updated, and then some feature requests that we're getting. The one open question is how we tag our published dependencies, and we're still working through some questions there. We want to move slowly and carefully before we change any strategy to make sure we get maximum compatibility. But that's where we are for Go modules.
Thanks for your hard work, Jordan, Stefan. I think it's come out really well and solves a lot of the problems that we used to have, and it's definitely way better than what we used to do before.
To be clear, it was a low bar, but I'm glad we exceeded it.
That's wonderful. Thank you for the update on it, and I'm glad to see that the change went so fast and so smoothly. So far, anyway. All right. Dims, there's a line here about restructuring code dependency. It dropped 200,000 lines of code. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm working on that. So the background out to this one is C Advisor was pulling in a bunch of dependencies that we didn't really need, or we had already eliminated, like Rocket and Mesos. So we had to do some work on the C Advisor side, and again, Jordan helped with a lot of the changes there as well, to kind of like restructure the code so we don't pull in everything that C Advisor needs for itself. So we had to distinguish between what C Advisor needs to support all its runtime versus what we support in our use of the C Advisor. So that's the change that's going to drop like 190K lines of code, specifically from Mesos and Rocket. It's a few files that were generated that were used most of it, but still it's a significant drop in what we need to support.
That's fantastic. All right, I think we can move on. Is there anything else under code organization that anyone had to talk about?
I was wondering if we're going to have reoccurring meetings for the code organization subproject anytime soon.
Yeah, I have the pen on that. So I was waiting for some of these preliminary stuff to land. Now that we have the Go stuff, we we are piloting some of the things with like the Docker dependency and the C advisor dependency. So those, and the Docker is landing today. C advisor will land probably tomorrow. So I wanted to get the mechanism smooth first. Then Alok is, for example, helping me try to figure out where we need to do, what we need to tackle next. And I pointed him to you, Andrew, to help prune dependencies. But here is what I need to do. I will send out an email to kind of like get us all started with an initial meeting, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound good? Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Dims, one last question on code organization. Do you want to briefly mention the discussion that you and I had yesterday? Is that something we need to bring up here?
Not relevant directly as such, but there was a scenario that Quinton and I were talking about yesterday, which is, do we currently have projects where in Kubernetes SIGs, which are co-owned by multiple SIGs, in the sense that the root, the owner's files have, basically have different SIGs. I don't remember that if we do, but this was something that came up in a meeting yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, the specific thing is fairly uncontroversial. There's a bunch of stuff that involves specialized batch jobs for machine learning, essentially. And there are parts of that which are, batch job stuff, which belongs in SIG apps these days, I understand. And there are parts of it which are scheduler things, which belong in SIG scheduling. And so we need a repo where we can put both of these things in. And it wasn't clear if there was any precedent, or should we just get the approval of both of those SIGs and essentially have them co-own the repo, or if anyone has any objections to that.
Right. And the, what we were talking yesterday also was, okay, so far what we have done is individual SIGs like SIG API machinery requested for an import of an external repository, and then they were willing to own that. So the precedence that we have is for glog, YAML. I don't remember exact. I was involved in these two at least, where they ended up in one specific SIG. So now, if we are going to do this between where multiple SIGs are involved, we don't have a precedent for that right now. And if we need to do this for an existing repository, then again, that is something that we haven't done that yet. So we'll have to figure out the best way probably to do this is to start a CAP with information on what the code is going to be and who's going to own it, and get the SIGs to sign off, and then start the GitHub process. Does that sound right to folks, or is there anything else that we need to do, or something differently?
Yeah, one issue that could come up, it's not necessarily always about the location of the code. It's also about who owns the tests, and if we have tests, if the test starts failing, stuff like that, causing regression, who is the SIG responsible for taking care of those?
If it's outside of the core, inside of Kubernetes SIGs, it's completely independent and based upon the owner's files of that thing.
That is true. If it's outside of the core and we don't care about them, sure, yeah, I agree.
All right. One more thing that I've heard from before is people saying, oh, if it is not in the main KK repository, I don't want to actually be responsible for it. So again, that's why I think it makes sense to, since we are going to span multiple SIGs, and if it's existing code and things like that, so I think it would make sense to like do a CAP. Does that sound fair to everyone?
Yes, but generally, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying that if most of these like sub-projects, which are not necessarily owned by SIGs, but they are sponsored by SIGs, are not necessarily taken care of by the SIGs, and they have separate owner files. They don't necessarily need to have like a SIG owner. If that's the case, then probably we shouldn't care as much about a particular SIG owning them.
Yeah, and Bobby, just to be clear, this is actually the stuff that you and I discussed last week,
Right.
or whenever it was. Yeah, it's exactly that topic. Yeah.
Okay. So
that's exactly the case for like SIG cluster lifecycle sponsors, and it doesn't own a bunch of individual repositories. The only purpose of us being on the owners files is to clean up in the state of Kobayashi Maru. Like in the no-win scenario, when we need to put this thing in the attic, we have ACLs and rights to push it into a different location. Other than that, the owners files are the source of truth, and they are the ones that maintain it.
Right. So that is just for the ownership part, right? Now, we also have to talk about if you're going to get code in from an existing repository outside that was developed outside, then what is there? What do we do right now? What we do right now is we get the SIGs to sign off, we get the SIG architecture to sign off, and then we essentially tell the GitHub, the people who manage our GitHub resource, to create the repository. So I guess we have to do exactly the same thing here as well.
Probably, although I don't know that we need to have two SIGs owning it. As it was kind of said, I think everything these days falls under a single SIG, which in many cases, again, is Kobayashi proof or something like this. If something happened and everybody left, you need to have somebody with rights. And SIG Apps has some projects that are the same way. Right. So this is probably one of those things where if it's people from multiple SIGs, they can collaborate on the sub-project as long as all the normal processes go through. And then one SIG will end up owning it, but that ends up being providing a venue for it at KubeCon, or in the event of everybody going away, having rights to archive it, those kinds of things. I don't know that we need to have multiple SIGs, and some of the stuff we work on in SIG Apps is a perfect example, because we work with SIG Node and SIG scheduling and things like that, and we've had to divide up who owns it. And some things like pod disruption budgets have actually moved from one SIG to another to who owns these things over time. Right. Even when people on both sides end up working on it. So I don't know if we need to go that kind of complex on it, as long as we have the right people in the owner's file for the project if it successfully moves over. But I do think that a KEP is probably the right way to proceed with this. And then we've got the paper trail, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, right. That kind of thing.
Right. Matt, there is one more twist to this. Like we don't have enough twists. The other twist that we have is, what if the scope of the code that is coming in exceeds the thing that is specified in the charter for the specific SIG?
That's exactly the case of essentially overlapping SIGs. And I think what Matt just said is we just pick one of the SIGs that it overlaps into, and we declare that to be the owner of the repo.
Yeah, and if you probably get sign-off from both of the SIGs on it, I don't think there will be a big deal. And the charter could be amended, and you can bring the right people in from the steering committee, and you can have all the SIGs sign off on it, and everyone will probably be okay with that. That's what I would pursue first.
Sounds good. So just to repeat, sorry, Bobby, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, there are a number of these incubator projects which are sponsored by particular SIGs. And some of them, as you said, they are owned by even multiple SIGs, and we could have even more of those. One thing that I've noticed, at least in the case of our own SIG scheduling, is that a lot of these projects are developed completely independently. In other words, and not in a very political way, we don't care about them in a way, right? So it's just people who own those repositories are free to check in anything they like. And, sometimes people go away, other people take over, stuff like that happens. And since they are still under the Kubernetes repository, I believe there is a sense of trust in such repositories. And people may think that the code in these repositories are benign and have certain quality, while that's a basically false impression. a lot of times, many of the folks who are really responsible for the SIGs don't know even what is exactly going on in terms of like code quality and all in these repositories. They are kind of like Wild West. People put anything they like in these repositories. Do we have any particular procedures or policies about these repositories?
So this was explicitly specified as part of the steering committee governance and project structure that Brendan Burns created the organizational structure around. We should probably update language to basically make it clear that these are not Kubernetes core projects. I mean, by creating the Kubernetes SIGs repo, that was the exit strategy we had for people that wanted to find a home for having bots and unified structure for ability to access things. So like you can use similar style mechanics inside of Kubernetes SIGs as you do inside of Kubernetes. But there's no guarantees at all for what exists inside of Kubernetes SIGs. And that's spelled out, but I don't know how we want to publicize this. And there's a broader set of issues that arise from this. Like we need to make sure that things that are created in there have some type of naming convention maybe that allows things, if they create CRDs, that those CRDs are well typed or well scoped to a given name, so that way it's clear what is core and what is not. I think we should have some conventions, but we haven't formalized any of that.
I agree, but one thing is that a lot of people see a link, for example, to download certain code from a certain place, and as soon as they see that, for example, the link is pointing to a Kubernetes repository, that sense of trustworthiness comes with it. They don't necessarily go and read all the documents. So we should probably basically along the same line, what is the benefit of having these repositories under Kubernetes?
Right, and more specific reason I would say is this code that is coming in going to be used by other projects in Kubernetes? Which is what we've been doing so far. We did the CSI stuff, cloud provider stuff. It's all feeds into other Kubernetes projects or pulled in by libraries or whatever, right? So is there any overlap of such kind in the incoming code? That would be the other question I would ask.
Yeah, that's basically very much similar to the question that I asked. That's one of the obvious benefits of having these repositories then.
Right.
If we really want to use those pieces of code. If we don't, maybe we should postpone bringing them to the point that we actually need to use them in the core or in other parts of Kubernetes.
Right.
I just wanted to make an observation that this is a very analogous sort of situation to what we have in the CNCF in general. We have CNCF projects. The fact that they're in the CNCF conveys some kind of degree of trust, but the CNCF itself, the staff of the CNCF or the TOC or whoever do not actually verify exactly what goes in there. They do some due diligence at some point when the thing enters, and the de facto way of dealing with this is either if there is something bad happening in a project, someone escalates that. There's a well-defined escalation path where you can say, I don't like what this project is doing. And conversely, there's also like an annual review process where once a year we have a look at the stuff that's in the CNCF and we say, oh, that still should be here, or it should be retired or archived or whatever. So should we have the same situation here?
I'm going to try and table this conversation because this is not SIG Arch, this is steering. And there's documentation around this that outlines this that was created by steering. And if we want to refine the process or if we have issues, I highly recommend folks file an issue with the steering repository and we'll follow up on that item.
So this was a little Mott and Bailey. Yesterday we were talking about this and we said we wanted to move it. I think what we should probably do is get this into a written form and decide whether it's steering or Arch and then move it to one of those. But yesterday we were talking about doing it in Arch. So I think there's I think we need to decide the steering committee, if we want to bump it to steering committee, ask whether it's there, and then we should make a.
There were two distinct conversations that were non-overlapping, Clayton. This one is different than the conversation we had yesterday. The conversation
is similar enough to me that I disagree. So I'm just saying, I agree. We probably need to clarify which one it's under, and you're probably not wrong that steering has established something already. I just think we need to clarify which one it's in.
Yeah, the creation of repositories and the guidelines of what promises exist there, what type of suppositions we make, that alone was created by steering. Like how they do their business, which was the what, the how was the question of we don't care, and that's a separate SIG Arch discussion to define of like if people want to have some type of policy thing.
Right.
Okay, so just to okay, I'm okay with tabling this for later, but I just want to make sure that we give some guidance to Quinton saying, okay, KEP seems to be like the right thing to do, and get the people from the multiple SIGs involved to make that happen, right?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and if there's something else, Clayton and Tim, if we could get it in writing from the steering committee, so that way we've got some traceability, that would make a lot of this conversation easier for a future.
I would flip that statement. I would say for folks who have questions or issues to raise an issue, and then we will try to create documentation around that issue.
Okay. Moving on to the next sub-project we have to cover, we have conformance. And Tim, I believe this is you.
The first up was a PSA that we had switched from weekly to biweekly. I think the purpose or intent behind the initial weekly is to get everybody up to speed, who's going to the conformance meetings. And no one objected to going to biweekly. I thought weekly was a bit too much. Just as a number of PSAs that kind of follow on from here. The first is that we're kind of updating the criteria for promotion and for what a conformance test is, in part to take into account some of the Windows isms that exist and making sure it's very explicit. So as people do reviews, they have enough literature to go back on and to verify. There's also an update to people who are doing reviews and approving that they can kick the Windows test via the bots. So I highly recommend taking a look at that PR if you have a chance, especially if you're a reviewer or an approver. There are a bunch of follow-on items. We had a discussion this week with regards to the number of images and the base images that we want to use for the tests. The sheer number of images that we have inside the tests is overwhelming. And there's a question of whether or not we want to start to have a standard set of base images that we can use across our test suite. And we're going to follow up with that. I know Dims was going to talk with Patrick and Claudio.
Yeah, I have an update from that. The three of us talked today, and we wrote up what we did. It's back in the notes for wherever the document was. So basically, the issues are around how do we make sure that we can build a Windows image with the make files and the Docker files in our KK repository, either in the CI or when somebody builds it by hand for a test image, for example, right? And be sure that it ends up in the manifest, which for the multiple architectures. So that's the basic problem. So we were trying to figure out what can we do now for 115.
Okay. And that's probably what we'll have to break up during the next conversation of what we want to try to accomplish. As a group, we walked through group prioritization using Brian's old doc as a rubric. I think we should probably try to refine and have explicit prioritization for how we want to evaluate what we should be doing next. And I think we'll talk about that during the next meeting. Last but not least, there's a couple of asks that are ongoing for some test automation work to help refine and manage our project board a little bit easier. So if folks are interested in test automation stuff, there's an issue and link inside of the main conformance doc. And currently our project board has a backlog of about 10 items for Clayton and Brian if they get a chance to clear those out for approval.
All right, thank you, Tim. Any other questions or comments or anything with conformance? All right, I'll take silence as none. Then we have API reviews, the third sub-project. Jordan, back to you.
Yep, so we're kicking off reviews for the 115 timeframe, and we're trying to iterate on the shadowing process that we took last release. So the people that participated in the shadowing process last release, the feedback was positive. Some of the ways we want to improve on that are being more intentional about who is getting involved. And so to that end, we're trying to sort of segment up areas by domain expertise and ask SIGs who have items that are going to involve API changes to identify specific people to participate in shadowing and be involved in an ongoing basis. And the goal is to develop expertise in those people and let them start to be sort of first pass reviewers, and eventually, once they get experience across several different types of changes, up to API approvers. So there's a linked pull. The first step is to kind of identify the existing approvers, like which areas they've worked in and have knowledge in. And the next step will be asking SIG owners and leads to identify people from their areas. And there are commented out aliases that will identify those people, and that will give us a really good way to funnel reviews to the right people quickly. And so the next step is to, when questions do bubble up, new types of APIs or new concepts. There's one about operating system specific fields, how we resolve those. And so I'll be setting up kind of an office hours thing similar to what the Conformance subproject has been doing. I was picking Tim's brain about how they've been running things. So there's a document there that has a couple specific questions that have come up that need to be resolved, and then we'll try to figure out a way to collect those and make progress on them between meetings, but then have like a regular meeting that acts as a forcing function to make decisions there. So I'll be sending a poll out for the time. I'll probably start it bi-weekly. I'll learn a lesson from the Conformance one and not try to be an overachiever. Probably start bi-weekly and then pick a specific place, either mailing list or Tim was saying the discuss topics were working well for them, where we can start discussions ahead of time.
All right, thank you, Jordan. Are there any other comments or questions on API reviews? All right, then we'll move on to the last topic, which is I have KEPs here. KEPs in 114 became a mandatory thing for features and changes to land into Kubernetes. And in 115, that's going to continue along. And so those that relate to SIG architecture are something we're going to want to keep on top of, just to make sure we don't inadvertently block someone, to make sure we're reviewing them. We've got somebody assigned to approve them if we need that, and so forth. And so the couple of quick links I have in here are for the 114 or 115 release. So anything that's going into the release, even if it's a KEP, needs a tracking issue, and that tracking issue should end up in the 115 release. And then there are all the SIG architecture KEP updates. You can find both of those. As of right now in 115, so the 115 release, the list is really short. There's only one SIG architecture one, which is to add Go module support to Kubernetes. That is already ongoing, as we talked about. The list right now doesn't have much in it because they haven't started curating it or working on it. That is something that they plan on doing later this week, early next week, to get the ball rolling on this. And so it's something we'll need to keep our eye on. And I just wanted to put the links in here and make sure everyone's aware. You'll see there are 9 or 10 things that are currently there across various SIGs. So maybe one of your other SIGs has something in here that needs review, but these are all the things that are being tracked for 115 at the moment. We'll expect that to change probably by the time we meet back in 2 weeks, and maybe we'll have something to talk about. But I just wanted to raise that up. All right, we've got about 27 minutes left, and we've burned through the agenda. That's fantastic. So we can have a minute for open discussion, just in case there's something that needs to come up. So does anyone have anything else that we need to discuss, or is there something we should break early for? I'm going to take silence as we don't have any topics. That's wonderful. So everyone gets about 26 minutes back. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your time, and have a wonderful couple of weeks. We'll meet back again in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for running this, Matt.
Yeah.